In this tutorial, I'll be going through how to add a new dataset with its one or more variables to the Hydroclimate2k database. There's a little bit of assumed knowledge that I'm not going to go through. The first is, what is a lipid file? There are some great resources for that already out there. I'll provide a link to a tutorial for that down below. The other is, it would help if you have an understanding of what a data set is as opposed to the variables it contains. Again, I've put a little guide for that in the Hydroclimate2k folder, and I'll pop a link to that for your handy reference as well. I'll also show you where that is in just a moment. Now I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so just before we get into it, I'll give you a broad overview of the process before we're going to step through it in detail. So I'll show you a worked example. But the overall sort of concept of how we're gathering this database is that every data set that we are assessing for inclusion in the database, and then maybe ultimately including, is in its own folder, which follows this particular naming convention that I'll go through in a second. And then that data set in its folder sort of flows through a series of stages, each of which is their own folder. Now, some of these, which I've outlined in purple here, sit in your archive folder. So I'm showing you an example from the Lake Sediment Archive team, but it could be Coral Tree, whatever. And then two of these, steps 4 and 5, are folders that are shared by all archives and sit in the top level of our project drive. So most broadly, what the steps that happen is you'll identify a record for potential inclusion, make a folder for it, and put it in this first step, need to review, where you check if that data set meets all of the criteria for inclusion in the database. If it does, and the data are publicly available, so you can download them from the paper or whatever, then it goes straight to this folder number 3, add to compilation. If the record meets the criteria for inclusion, but the data aren't publicly available, it would go to this folder 2, where it waits, and then you email the author, ask if they're willing to share the data. And then if the author does send the data, then it would come into folder number 3. Once you have the data, you'll convert it to a lipid file, and that the folder will move to number 4, where it will be then ingested into the Hydroclimate2k database, whereupon the folder moves to number 5, and that's where it rests. If at any point the dataset fails one of the criteria for inclusion, or the data aren't publicly available, then it will go in this folder 6, reject from compilation. So that's the sort of broad strokes approach, which we'll go through in detail. Before we start there's just one thing that I really need to define that will make this all a bit easier, and that is the QC sheet. So what exactly the QC sheet is. So as you'll know, if you know what a lipid file is, every data set is associated, has some metadata associated with it, things like the latitude, the longitude, the site name, as does every variable, so things like the proxy type, and most importantly for this database, maybe the interpretation metadata, things like the environment interpretation, the climate interpretation. The QC sheets contain all of that metadata. So here I'm in the QC sheets folder. This is what it looks like. So if you think about every single data set and variable that's included in the database, there is one row for each variable, and each column here is a different metadata field. So for example, here we can see we've got the data set name, we've got the latitude, longitude, the elevation, various other things. That's all data set level metadata. And we have the variable level metadata, things like the actual variable, its units. As we get across here, we have the interpretation metadata, so the environment variable, the climate variable, and all of those things. Now this, what I'm showing you here, this is what we call the master QC sheet. And this is actually sort of directly connected to the database. So this sheet is actually used to update the metadata of all the variables in the Hydroclimate2k database. So if you make a change to one of these fields, the next time this QC sheet is used to update the database, that change will actually be reflected in that record's metadata. So if I went and changed this, for example, to coral or something, then the next time this is updated, that record would be marked as a coral. And this is, yeah, and the same, if this, there's a bunch of empty fields here. If I were to add something to this field, the next time this QC sheet was used to update the database, that metadata would be added. So it's quite important that the metadata that are added to or changed in this sheet are accurate. They've been well thought through because it's directly connected to the database. To avoid any potential issues, while we're, because there's a while while we're sort of figuring out what exactly the entries will be, in each archive folder, you have your own working versions of this QC sheet. So I'll show you the example for the lake sediment group. Here you should have a file like this in your own archive folder called working QC sheet. And this, looks almost exactly the same as the master QC sheet, but this one is not connected to the database. So it's like, you can think of it as sort of a sandbox where you can be getting the metadata together, editing it with no fear of actually affecting the database. And then when, you've been working on one record for a while, once the metadata is all polished up and you're really happy with it, then you can simply copy and paste it into the relevant columns of the master sheet. So here's the working QC sheet, of which every archive has one, and those entries are ultimately copied across to the master QC sheet. If any of that is unclear, you can just ask your archive leads or email me. If you're watching this video, you will almost certainly know what my email address is. Okay, so I think that is the background information we need. So now I'm going to step through an example of what it would look like to add a new record to the database. So you're all working in archive teams. I'm going to show an example here from the Lake archive group. And so these first steps are all going to happen in the, let's see, in your archive specific folder. So here's the top level of the Hydroclimate2k directory. Oh, actually, before I do that, I'm just going to show you while I'm here. In this top level of the project directory, there are some really handy files here that I suggest you familiarize yourself with. This includes the guidelines, both for adding a new record, so that's essentially written instructions for what I'm going through now, as well as for assessing records that are already in the compilation. I'll make another video for that. This handy definition sheet, which I suggest maybe if you haven't already seen this, you have a look at it before you watch the rest of this video, which goes through the difference between a data set and a variable, very key, as well as some schematics and this very handy, essentially, dictionary, which defines what metadata should go through every field in the QC sheet. So remember in the QC sheet, I'll just open it up again, there was one row for every record here and one column for every metadata field. In this definitions sheet, for every one of those metadata fields, there's a definition and a bit more detail. So this is your sort of gospel, if you like, your go-to if you're sort of a bit confused as to what should go in any one of the metadata fields. This is where you should come to check that. Okay, so back to it. Now I'm heading to the Lake team, where here are the folders where we would start the workflow. So the first thing that you would do, working, by yourself or maybe with some other people in your archive team, would be to scout around in the literature and find a record that you think you might like to include. So I have done that. Oops. And I found this really lovely 2000-year record of hydroclimate variability from the oxygen isotopic composition of ostracods in Lashmar's Lagoon on Kangaroo Island, which is a little island south of Australia. Okay. So I found this record. It's just published this year. Now, the first thing I want to do is to check that somebody isn't already working on this particular record. Now, we have a very nice system that tracks what records are moving through the workflow at any one time. And that is in this sheet here, which is called the workflow overview. So each of your archive groups will have a version of one of these sheets called the workflow overview. And what this is we have a column for the dataset name, and then columns to track at what stage of the workflow overview that record is at. And this is very useful for a few reasons. At this stage, we can check to see if anyone isn't already working on this record. So all of these data sets follow the naming convention that's outlined in our various instruction guides, which is that it is the site name, then a full stop, then the name of the first author, then a full stop, and then the year of publication. So here, the site is called Lashmar's Lagoon. The first author is Mahfouz Rahman. This is published in 2025, so we can have a look here. Okay, great. It looks like nobody else is working on this particular record at the moment. So I can go ahead and make a start. Now, there are a few things that we have to do to get this going. Firstly, I'll go into this number one, need to review folder, the first step, and I will make a new folder for this data set. So following this naming convention that is used for all data sets, it is the site name, which here is Lashmar's Lagoon, and a full stop, and then the name of the first author, which that's Mahfouz Rahman, then a full stop, and then the year of publication. Okay, so I made the new folder. And immediately there are two things that you should add to this folder. The first is the paper. So I've already downloaded that. Here it is. So we add the paper to this folder. That's just uploading. And the second thing is a notes document where you will sort of log any notes or anything that is important that you've thought about, any considerations as this is moving through the workflow. So I'm just going to give this the same name, that same data set name, Lashmar's Lagoon 2025. And you'll see as we go through what sort of things we would be noting in here. Okay, so I've made a folder in here. It's named according to our naming convention. The next thing I need to do is to add a line for this in the workflow overview. And this is extremely important. So as soon as you have made the new folder, you've added the paper, you also need to add this record to the workflow overview. This is so other people can see that you're working on a record and what stage it's up to. If you think about it, this is useful for a lot of reasons, not just so people, there's no duplication of effort, but say, you go on holidays or leave the project for whatever reason, totally fine. This allows us to see what records were being worked on and what stage they're up to. Okay, so I'll pop in that same dataset name, Lashmar's 2025. This is not a record that was inherited from an existing database. It's a new one, and it's now sitting in this folder number one, need to review. Okay, and there's also, if we scroll across, There we go, as a place to put our initials, so we know who's working on this. So that's my initials, G Foster. You can put your name, whatever. Okay, just a little bit of clarification here. So in this particular paper, I've read the paper. It has data just from one site, Lashmar's Lagoon on Kangaroo Island. If there was a single paper that presented data from multiple sites, so say 2 different lakes or 2 different marine sediment cores, each of those different locations would have their own data set, which means they would have their own folder that would move through the workflow. So say in this particular paper, say there was one core from Lashmar's Lagoon and another one from Duck Lagoon, which is another place nearby, then we would have one folder called lashmarslagoon.ramen.2025, a second called ducklagoon.ramen.2025, and that would move through independently. If there are multiple variables from a single site, so say, as you'll see in this case, there are multiple proxies being measured on the same core or whatever, these are all included in the one data set. So yeah, just check that guide I showed you, I'll just go back to it if that's confusing. This guide here goes through that in more detail. It's a little bit more complicated maybe for things like trees and maybe coral heads, where multiple trees from across the region might be included in a chronology. Same thing with multiple coral heads. That's if you're a bit confused about that, then just talk to your archive leads. They'll be able to clarify. Okay, so I've identified a record, I've made a folder for it in this first step of the workflow overview, I've added it to the workflow overview. The last thing I'll do at this point, you don't have to do this now, but I find it easier, is also to add at least the data set as a new line to our archive's working QC sheet. Now, as you will see from the guide, actually, any one data set will often have multiple lines in the QC sheet because there's one line per variable. So say, a lake sediment core, they measure the delta 13C and the delta 018, or ostracods, that's 2 variables from a single data set. But I like to just at least get one entry in here and get a little bit of metadata in. So here's the working QC sheet. I'll add the data set name. Sorry, I'm just going to hide the video panel. Oops, nope. Hide thing. There we go. So there we go. Lashmar's Lagoon. Archive type is lake sediment. At this point, I can also, actually this makes things a bit easier later on. If you want, you can add a bit of the dataset level metadata, things like the latitude and longitude. Let's see, do we have those here? Yeah. So in this working QC sheet, everything that goes into here comes from the paper. So, that's essentially what you're doing. You're going through a paper and picking out the really key information and adding it to this sheet so that it's captured in our database. So the latitude and longitude, these are entered in decimal degrees. So you might need to, at this point, if the paper you're reading has the latitude and longitude in degrees milliseconds, you might need to convert that to decimal degrees. Here, pleasingly, the authors have provided that information in decimal degrees already. They've actually provided a sort of a range of values that bound this lagoon. If I was doing this properly, I'd probably, find the midpoint of this, but just for the sake of what I'm showing you now, I'm just going to copy the southernmost and easternmost extents. Now, because this is south, that's going to be minus 35. There we go. And this is east, so I can just copy it straight in. Okay, that'll probably do for now. I'll add the site name too. you can be adding metadata. Once you've started moving a record through the workflow, you can be adding the metadata to the working QC sheet at any point. It doesn't really matter at what stage you do this. I just like to get a couple of things in to get the record going. Okay, so we have now sort of accomplished the first things to start moving a record through the workflow. I've made a new folder for this data set. I've added the paper. I've started a notes document. Critically, I've added it to the workflow overview. I've also started a line for it in the working QC sheet. Now, the next thing that we do is to assess whether we do or do not want to include this particular record in the Hydroclimate2k database. And so for that, we have this document called Criteria for Dataset Inclusion in the Database. You might also have a copy of this in your archive folder because there are, a few bits and pieces that sort of complicate things a bit for different archives, but there are some fundamental criteria that every dataset needs to meet. So first is that the record in the publication is primarily interpreted as a hydroclimate record. So, not temperature or something, but it is a hydroclimate proxy record. Then we have a resolution criterion, which is that they have to have at least 50 years in the past 2,000 years. And then there is also some chronology criteria. I'm not going to go through these. You can look at them yourself. But you would have a look at this and then decide whether or not this record that you have identified meets all of those criteria. Okay. So I've already done that for this particular record. So here's the paper. I've had a look through. I've had a look at the chronology. I've had a look at the data. Both of those look good. They both pass our chronological and resolution cutoffs for inclusion in the database. I've also had a look at what the authors have said about the interpretation of the particular variables they've used. And yes, they state that they are primarily hydroclimate proxy variables. So that's great. This record has passed the criteria for inclusion. Now, this record is quite straightforward. If it is not straightforward, you think you might have to do some thinking, that is the sort of place where you could make a note of that in this notes document. So here, I always like to add the date. I just say this was the case, so I'd say, not sure if this is a hydroclimate record, discuss at next meeting. Or something along those lines, just so if people come to this and they're curious as to what's going on, there's a record of your thought process as you're adding this record or considering the addition of this record to the database. So that's one thing you can use this notes document for. Now, if it had been the case that this record failed one of those initial criteria, so say there was insufficient chronological control, it was too low resolution, it wasn't primarily a hydroclimate record, again, we would go into this notes document. We would add a note as to why we're not going to include it. So insufficient chronological control or whatever, we would put a note so that we know why this record wasn't included in the database. And in that case, we would take this record, so Lashmar's Lagoon, and move it to this folder 6, reject from compilation. At the same time, we would go to the workflow overview and put across over here in this column number 6, reject from compilation. So that way, if somebody's, they've come across this paper, they think, oh, maybe I'll include this in the database. they would come to this sheet, they would see, okay, someone's already assessed it. Oh, interesting, they've decided to reject it from the compilation. They'd be able to go to that records folder in number 6 here and have a look at the notes you've made as to why that was rejected. So just so that we keep track of all of these things. Okay. But that's not the case in this, for this particular record, which has indeed passed. So the next step is to establish whether or not the data are publicly available. So in this case, let's see, we can go down to the bottom here. Yes, it turns out that the data are publicly available. This author really made everything very easy. It's a lovely record. So in that case, you would download the data. I've done this in advance, so I won't waste your time with that. You would download the data and then add that to the folder. There we go. So it's just uploading. There it is. And then I would move the folder straight to number 3, add to compilation. Okay, so I've assessed the record. I've said, yeah, this is suitable for inclusion. I've got the data. In this case, it was very easy. I could just get it straight from the publication. And then I've moved it to this folder 3, add to compilation. At the same time, so every time you move a folder from one location to another, we should also update its location here on the workflow overview. So it's no longer in need to review, it's now in folder 3, add to compilation. I would also make a note in the notes document to say data downloaded from publication and put a link to that, just so we know where the data have come from originally. And that's great. Now, if the data were not publicly available, then instead we would move that data set to this second folder, number 2, need data, and then send an email to the first authors of the paper asking if they would be happy to make the data available for our database. When you're sending that email, if you're not quite sure how to phrase it or want some help, then feel free to talk to your archive leads. They can help you out. Myself or Matt Jones can also help you with that. So in that case, if you know the record is suitable for inclusion, but the data aren't publicly available, you would move the folder to number 2, need data. You would mark that, of course, on the workflow overview. You would also make a note in the notes document on a particular date. You emailed the author to request data. You could even copy the body of the email message in here, just so you know, so we've got a record of what happened. Now from here, if the authors come back and say, yeah, of course, here's the data, great, you would make a note of that here, say data received from the authors on whatever date, add that spreadsheet to the folder and then move it to number 3, add to compilation, mark its location here in the workflow overview. If the authors get back to you and say, look, sorry, no, I wouldn't like for my record to be included in your database, of course, that's fine. Again, you would make a note of that in the notes document, say data not made publicly available, and then you would move that to folder 6, reject from compilation. In this case, the record has been rejected because the data are not publicly available. Again, then you would go to the workflow overview and mark that is where that particular record is sitting. Okay, so where are we at? All right, so now in this case, we have our record, we've identified it. I've got the actual data. The next step is to take that data and to convert it to a lipid file. Now, the easiest way to do that, there are a few ways, but the easiest way is to use the lipid playground. So this is just loading. This is what the lipid playground looks like. It's lipid.net/playground. I am not now going to step through the process of making a lipid. Again, there are resources for that. I'll try to put a link below. Otherwise, you can ask your archive leader or one of us later. But essentially, you will use the data here that you've got, along with a little bit of metadata, things like the dataset name, the latitude and longitude. You'll enter all of those into this GUI, and then you can just press this button here, download as lipid, and that will give you a lipid file. But to save a bit of time, here is one that I have prepared earlier. So here it is. It's got the same, so this all follows the same dataset naming convention, which is site name, author, date. So here is the lipid file I've made. I would add that to the folder and then move, once we've made a lipid and added it to the folder, we will move the folder to the next stage of the workflow, which is this number 4 in lipid pending lipid verse. Okay. And remember, this folder 4 in lipid pending lipid verse, so once you've got the record, you've got the data, you've converted it to a lipid, it's now actually ready to be included in the database. Very exciting. So every archive group, as they're working, all of the, once they make lipid folders, these all flow into this shared folder, folder 4. So you can see we've actually got a few records that are piling up here, ready to go. So once we've moved the folder in here, once we've made our lipid, we're waiting for the record to be added to the lipid verse. We must, of course, mark the new location of the folder in the workflow overview. If you like, you can also make a note, 2025 17 converted to lipid, using downloaded data or whatever. I'm just going to note at this point that there are a few sort of decisions that I've skimmed over here. In the case of this particular record, the authors actually they published their data in quite a lot of detail. So, this is a paper looking at the oxygen isotopic composition of ostracods. They actually published their data separated by species, as well as a sort of pooled average isotopic composition across the various species. When I was making my lipid, I actually only used the pooled values. I did that because of some statements that, I read the paper and read how they'd done their data handling, their recommendations for the use of the data, and I followed those. But I might actually want to make a note of that in this notes folder, just for reference, so used pooled values following recommendations of author, something like that, just so we have a log of why any particular decisions are being made. These are also the sorts of things that you might want to talk through with your archive teams. Okay, so we have our record. It's now sitting in this folder 4 in lipid pending lipid verse. Once enough records accumulate in this directory, so they're flowing in from all of the archive teams, our Chief Lipid Wrangler, Nick McKay, will get all of these and use them to update our database. So he'll add them to the database, and then at that point, we'll generate a new QC sheet. And once that update has been done, your new record will magically appear as a new row on the QC sheet, on the master QC sheet, that is. So this is a QC sheet with all the variables in all of the data sets currently included in our Hydroclimate2k database. Lashmar's Lagoon won't be on here because it's not been added yet. But after I have put that record here in folder 4 as a lipid, then Nick's gone, grabbed that out of this folder, ingested it into the database and generated a new QC sheet. My new record will appear as some new rows at the bottom here. There'll be the sort of basic information that I included when I made the lipid will be here, like the dataset name, the archive type, maybe some publication information, latitude, longitude. And then there'll be lots of empty spaces here for all of the interpretation metadata. As to what metadata are entered when you make the lipid versus here, I've listed that in the definitions, the sort of dictionary of metadata fields. Okay, so once that's done, you'll be notified that there's been a QC sheet update, and then we can, this actually hasn't happened, but I'll show you what you would do. Then you would move that from folder 4 in lipid pending lipid verse to the next stage, which is folder 5 added to lipid verse. And this folder 5 added to lipid verse, that actually is the final resting place of your records folder. So once it's here, that data are now in the database, it's on the lipid verse. All that remains is to enter the metadata. So this is where it's the final place for your folder. Of course, you would then mark its location here in the workflow overview. So that's our lipid process. The part I haven't talked about yet is the metadata entry. Okay, and you'll see there are 2 columns here in the workflow overview sheet that are related to where you're at with the metadata. The first is that you can mark this once you have added all relevant metadata to the working QC sheet, so to your archives working QC sheet. And then one last column that you would tick once you're happy with that metadata, it's all polished up, and you have copied it across into the master QC sheet, which essentially means that metadata are now finalized in the actual database. Okay. And so I'll just go through a little bit of that now. The metadata entry, it's a bit trickier. It's maybe something you'll talk about with your archive teams. But again, as I said already, it's essentially going through the paper and pulling out the relevant bits of information. Okay, so we do all of that in our working QC sheet. Now, the way I like to do this, which I recommend you do also, is, so you read through the paper and highlight the relevant bits of information. So here's the paper. I found there's a latitude and longitude here, which, that's included in the metadata. Now we'll see here, so it's ostracods is the sort of the thing that's been measured in this case, and there's a bit about the chronology. And you can see here the authors have measured both the oxygen and the carbon isotopic composition of those ostracods. So that tells us that there are actually 2 variables that have been measured from this particular data set. So that means we'll need 2 rows in the metadata sheet. It's the same site, so the same data set, which means that this site level metadata is the same, but we have 2 different variables. So we have delta 18O and delta 13C. In both cases, the units are per mil. Okay. Now let's see. So I'm just going to change the view of this. It's a bit annoying. How do I do that? Menu. View. Sorry about this. Okay, so you can see in this paper, and you could actually go and have a look in this workflows folder, which is on the drive, and have a look for yourself. But I've highlighted the various sort of relevant bits of information that I think are necessary for filling in the various metadata fields. And so, I've read it, and then I've found, there's all this sort of interpretation that the authors have done. It's very nice. And there's this very helpful statement here that actually helped me screen this particular record for inclusion, which is these observations support the use of the combined ostracod delta 18 data as a hydroclimate proxy in this instance. Okay, that's great. Now, of the metadata that we enter, there are really 3 key interpretation fields, and these are the ones that require a bit of thinking. I'm just going to show you. So here are the definitions for each field in the definitions sheet. This is all the data set level metadata, stuff related to just the variable. But these here, the environment interpretation, the climate interpretation, and the dynamical system, these are the meat of our database. This is what really distinguishes Hydroclimate2k as a tool specifically for assessing hydroclimate variability across the Common Era. So it's really important that we think about these and sort of get them right. So the environment variable, this is sort of the variable that has the most minimal degree of interpretation. So I suggest you read through this. You have to think about it a little bit. Then the climate variable is what it says. It's the climate variable that is inferred from that reconstructed environmental variable. And then finally, the dynamical system, that's sort of, if this record reflects variability in any one particular climate mode, things like ENSO, the NAO, SAM, that sort of thing. There are also metadata fields here to support those interpretations, things like the basis for that, any other details, the seasonality, and so forth. So these are the things that you're looking for when you read the paper. So in this case, let's see. So I've got, here's the 2 rows for the delta 18, delta 13C of ostracods in this particular record. The measurement material here, I would say that the measurement material is carbonate and the detail is ostracods in both cases. There we go. And now we get to the environment interpretation. So I'm just going to do this for the delta 18. I'll show you why in a moment. I'm going to skip completely over the delta 13C. Now, as I'm reading through the paper, let's see. It's various interpretations. But the authors, they go through it in great detail. It's very nice. But ultimately what they say is that although the delta 18 of an ostracod's carbonate can reflect variability in various different parameters, in this case, the primary driver of variability, the primary environmental driver of variability in the ostracod delta 18 is the delta 18 of the lake water. Okay. And so let's see. Yeah, there's the delta 18 of the lake water. So that is what we would put in this case, for the environment variable. So let's see. I think there might be is there a controlled term for this? I'm not sure. Yeah. Sorry, I'm just having a look at this. Yeah. So I think I'm going to put this in here for now. I might think about this a bit more, This is the sort of stuff you might want to discuss with your archive team, whatever. But I'm just going to put this here now, the delta 18 of lake water. So that's the environment variable. It's the thing with the most minimal degree of interpretation from that particular proxy. So that's the variable. There are also fields here for direction. So for example, if the delta 18 of the ostracod carbonate goes up, does that reflect an increase in the delta 18 of the lake water or a decrease? In this case, it's a positive relationship. Here we've got the seasonality and also the basis. And this basis is a really useful field. This is a free text field where if I want, I could copy chunks of text from the paper that describe why we are interpreting the delta 18 of the ostracods as the delta 18 of lake water. There are also fields for secondary environmental interpretations. In this case, the authors have actually provided sort of a very nicely listed series of things that can they influence the delta 18 of the ostracods. Secondarily, the isotopic composition of precipitation. which I think has a control term, but that's fine. I'll put that in later. That's the secondary driver. They actually had a third, which is like water temperature, which I can also add. At the moment, your QC sheets, I think, only have space for 2, but we can increase that. And so we can, yeah, there we go. We can add those in. This is all coming straight from the paper. The second thing here then is the climate variable. So what is the climate variable that in this case controls the delta 18 of the lake water? Again, Mahfouz has made this extremely easy for us because he states it very clearly here. Let's see, I've highlighted it. Where did I put it? Anyway, you can have a look at this for yourself. But essentially, he says, there we go, that P on E, so the local relationship of precipitation to evaporation is the primary driver of the delta 18 of ostracods here. Very nice. And he's even said for us, and this would exhibit a negative correlation with delta 18 of ostracod. So here I can put that straight into the metadata. So it's P on E is the climate variable, and the direction is negative. Lovely, isn't it? Okay, very easy. I could put more details in here. I'm not going to do that now. You'll get very bored. Then we would have space here for a second climate interpretation, if that existed, so on and so forth. So that's the environment and the climate variable. The final one is dynamical system. So this may or may not be in all the papers you read, but again, this paper has made it very easy for us, where they've got their section drivers of regional hydroclimate, and they go on ultimately to say that the primary dynamical driver of P&E at this location is variations in the southern annular mode in SAM. So they've said that here, and so I can copy that into the dynamical system field. So you can see here it's all flowed on very nicely. The delta 18 of the ostracods is primarily driven by the delta 18 of lake water, which in turn is primarily driven by the ratio of precipitation to evaporation over that lake. And that is ultimately driven by one particular dynamical driver, which is the southern annular mode. Beautiful. Okay. So that's that. You know, I would tinker with this. I'd fill in all the other fields. Once I'm happy with it, I would mark that the metadata are complete in the working QC sheet. Then once I'm really confident everything's great, and you know, once this has been added, of course, as it has to the databases, the field for it in the master QC sheet, the final step would be to go ahead and add that into the master QC sheet, which means that the next time the database is updated, all of that metadata will be included. And that would be the full integration of that particular record into the database. Now, the final thing I want to talk about here is what to do with variables that are published in a paper, but are not primarily driven by hydroclimate, so that we don't actually want to include in our particular database. Now, say, you know, something like a lake record, you might be looking at an XRF record where there are 20 different elements scanned, but maybe one or two of them only are hydroclimate relevant, same with any other archive. In this case, the published data include both the delta 13C and the delta 018 of ostracods. The authors state here, somewhere I've highlighted it, that the delta 13C interpretation is not straightforward, it's not easy to link to hydroclimate, and therefore whilst they provide the data for us, they don't interpret that at all, and therefore we don't want to include that particular variable from this data set in our database. However, it is nice to have the data included in the lipid file. Someone might want to, you know, we're also sort of packaging up this person's research data into a lipid file, so we don't want to be sort of separating that. And there is a way of dealing with this very straightforwardly. Again, this is defined, so you can read this later here. These two fields here, primary time series in this compilation, but I'll show you in the QC sheet. So if we scroll right across here, here are these two fields, primary time series, and in this compilation. This in this compilation field is particularly useful because this is either it's a true or false flag. If there is an entry of true, in this column, in this compilation, that means that we do want, for this particular variable, in this case, this is the delta 18 of ostracods, we want this variable to be included in the Hydroclimate2k database, to show up as part of the database. If there is another variable in that lipid file that we want to have there, but we do not want to be considered in this database, then we can simply add a false flag in that column. And so what this means is that the data are there, they're available in lipid, but they're not going to show up as part of our database. And this also means that you do not have to add in all of our interpretation metadata. So you'll still need the site level metadata. That's the same for all of the variables. You'll need to just describe what the variables are. So in this case, it's the delta 13C of carbonate ostracods. But all of these, the environment, the climate, and the dynamical system interpretations, you don't have to fill in. You can just leave those blank. Just add this false flag in this compilation field. So that, you might be doing that for, I can think of, it's easy for me to provide an example for lakes. So if you have lots and lots of XRF scanned elemental ratios, you might put in maybe the titanium to calcium ratio is the one you're interested in. You would put the flag true in this compilation field, and then all the rest of the elements you wouldn't bother putting in the metadata, and you would add the false flag to this field. Primary time series, don't worry about that for now. Your archive leaders will talk to you about that. It's quite similar. In this case, we would probably also put a true flag in there for this particular record. Okay, a last couple of things. In this particular paper, again, the authors have been extremely comprehensive in their analysis. They actually state that there's maybe some anthropogenic disturbance to this record near the top. We're working on maybe including a metadata field to capture that sort of information. It's probably mostly relevant to the lake team, maybe some others, but don't worry about it. But what I could do at this point, because there's maybe not somewhere at the moment to be including this in the metadata, is to make a note of that. Disturbance from XXH depth in the notes document, just so there's a record of that as a reminder. Okay, so I think that is everything. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. So that's how we'll go about adding a new record to the database that isn't already captured. I'm going to make another of these videos showing the process for taking a record that is already in the database, that's already showing up in the QC sheet, but that doesn't yet have our Hydroclimate2k interpretation metadata. That's a bit more straightforward. Otherwise, if you have any other questions about this process, feel free to email me. You should have my email address, judina.foster@adelaide.edu. Or Matt Jones, or talk to your archive leaders. They're probably the best bet in the first instance. And otherwise, good luck and happy metadataing.